series of programs for the entire family featuring many of the world's leading creationist speakers. They will answer your questions about creation and evolution and will demonstrate that the book of Genesis is reliable and vitally important.
Well, not so long ago, I was invited to be part of a television program while I was on a speaking tour up in Toronto, Canada. I didn't know anything about it in advance at all. I was just there for a series of talks and so. Speaking at a church, and one of the people who'd invited me there said, well, there's a television crew from the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, who would like to film your Friday night lecture and then do an interview on Saturday and put together a television program on creation evolution. Do you mind? Well, actually, I did. We've had some interesting run-ins with the media actually there have been a few good ones, but there was a lot of fear and trepidation, but my normal response is yes. I'll go ahead and do that. I feel like the Lord wants me to at least try. So they filmed the talk Friday night and the interview Saturday. And it turned out to be one of the fairest, nicest presentations that was ever done. It was very high-quality production. It's part of a popular Canadian series called the Man Alive series. And the opening scene really set the stage. And so as the credits began to clear away and so on, the camera showed a medieval princess walking in a castle garden. Here she was in this long flowing robe, a little pointed cap with a veil, and you could tell as she looked around that she was looking for something special. The music begins to play softly, and then the camera swings over to the ledge of a little pond, and sure enough, ribbit. Here's this frog on the edge of the pond with big bulging eyes, and then the camera goes back to the princess as she hears the sound and moves over toward the pond. Nah, they won't do that. This is public TV. No, they would never do that. Then back to the frog. Ribbit. And sure enough, the princess bends over, kisses the frog, and stars sparkle all over the screen. And behind the stars, out comes this handsome prince. And as the prince and princess engage in an embrace, the camera pans away from them and to the narrator, Roy Bonesteel, who walks into this idyllic scene and says, if you believe a frog turned into a prince instantly, that's a fairy tale. If you believe it took 300 million years, that's evolution. That was his words. It wasn't mine. He didn't get that from me. And now, part of that, of course, was meant to be kind of a dramatic introduction. But that is literally true. As we've mentioned several times, I was an evolutionist and taught evolution for several years in university biology classes. And actually, evolutionists really do believe that if you wait long enough, just time and chance and the struggle for survival will eventually turn some kind of amphibians like those frogs into people like that prince. No outside agency, no God is required at all or involved at all. All it takes is just time, chance, the struggle for survival. All you have to do is wait. And sure enough, start with a frog, out comes a prince. You do have to wait a long time, but that's all it is, no outside force involved at all. Well, now that's a good stirring story. There's no doubt about that. But if you want to put a fairy tale like that on a scientific basis, you'd better be prepared to show a whole series of fossils to show how a little bit, step by step, over those 300 million years, that frog gradually did turn into a human being. And of course, most recently, our most recent ancestor would be some kind of ape-like animal. And so that's what we want to take a look at today as our own origins, the origin of man. Is there any evidence that all you have to do is wait, and frogs will turn into lizards, that turn into mammals, that turn into apes, that turn into people? Well, the first fossils that were proposed as a link between man and animals were these famous Neanderthal specimens. I think almost everyone knows about Neanderthals. They're popularly called cave people. They were originally pictured as beetle-browed, barrel-chested, and bow-legged brutes. Suitable ancestor for an American football team. When they were first discovered, though, the Christians at that time said, hey, wait a minute. These aren't missing links. These aren't half man, half ape. Take a look at what we've got here. These people have excellent cave art. In fact, some of their cave art, in my opinion, and others, is much better than a lot of modern art. And they had a lot of evidence that they had belief in an afterlife that would imply abstract thought and so on. The brain volume of the average Neanderthal is much larger, or as large or larger, than the brain volume of the average Australian or European or American at the present time. They said the only problem with this kind of hunched over appearance is that they have bone diseases. Well, that was 100 years ago. Christians were saying things like that. 100 years later, the evolutionists finally caught on. By the way, if you see a conflict between the Bible and science, just wait, science will eventually catch up. Well, now we can even diagnose the bone diseases that the Neanderthal peoples had. Pyorrhea, gum disease, rheumatism, arthritis, things like that. Also, there were some problems due to lack of iodine in the diet in the Neanderthal specimens in the caves in Central Europe, and also due to lack of vitamin D. The Neanderthal peoples from the Mediterranean areas, such as Mount Carmel, didn't have the more stooped and massive features. And so now evolutionists have had to admit, without giving us any credit at all, that Christians were completely right. Neanderthals are just plain people. If anybody asks you, who were the cave people? People who lived in caves. And at today's housing prices, that's not such a bad idea. Nothing wrong with that at all. There's a fellow in Germany, a curator of a museum in Germany, who's actually done something creationists have suggested. I don't know whether you can see this picture from where you're sitting back there, but it simply shows a man in a nice-looking business suit in the foreground, and behind him, over the shoulder, somebody's reaching around straightening his tie. Well, a fellow straightening the tie is the curator of this museum in Germany, and the fellow in the foreground is actually their model of Neanderthal man. But the museum curator simply said, we've got to quit deceiving the public. And so he dressed their Neanderthal specimen up in an ordinary business suit, and one walking down the road today wouldn't attract any particular attention at all. In fact, there are plenty of people that still have the very same features that Neanderthal has. Not so many living in one area as there once were, but just ordinary people, Homo sapiens like you and I. The real tragedy is that Neanderthals were not the only people that were once regarded as subhuman missing links. And Ken told you about some of that yesterday. The Aboriginals here in Australia. I have some brothers that like to keep old newspapers and things like that. And there's an old newspaper from 1925 with a big article about the missing link has been found. And the missing link is what? It's the Aboriginals in Australia that they're talking about. And Ken told you about the Tasmanians that decided to line up across the island and shoot them because, after all, if they're not really human, they have no right to protection as human beings. Some people are saying that about very little human beings today, aren't they? And perhaps the most tragic story in the case of Tasmania is the last surviving Tasmanian woman, Truganini. Her dying wish was that when she died, she would be buried with her people, not shipped off to a museum. She died and was shipped off to a museum. If you're a missing link, you belong in a museum, not in a burial ground or cemetery with human beings. And that was only the 1920s. And I think the events of the 1920s and 30s had something to do with the events of the 40s, as you can see here. Again, Ken mentioned this to you yesterday, that in those days the blacks in Africa were considered subhuman missing links. And this is that quotation that Ken mentioned to you yesterday. A very famous anthropologist said, if an unbiased zoologist came to Earth from Mars, well, we know how much unbiased there is around, but this was his view. He felt so firmly about this as an evolutionist that if somebody just looked at the evidence, he said, he'd classify the people living on Earth at the present time not only into different species, but even into different genera, a larger break. And then he said if this hypothetical, unbiased evolutionary zoologist looked at the African blacks, the standard of intelligence of the average adult Negro is similar to that of the 11-year-old youth of species Homo sapiens. You see, not even the same species. And you can imagine what all has been done in the name of evolution in those terms. Well, we now know, of course, that the Bible was right all along. God is made of one blood, all the people that live on earth. We all have the same parents. Most modern evolutionists are real apologetic about that, and they're very sorry about the excesses of evolution in the 30s and 40s and so on. But it was part of their theory, and they've had to specifically reject it recently, again, only to find out that the Bible has been right all along. Well, the next fossil to attract much attention when it comes to human origins was a very famous one called Piltdown, given the scientific name Eanthropus dawsoni. Well, almost everybody now knows that Piltdown was a deliberate hoax. Not a very clever hoax at that. The real mystery is not who did it, but why did anybody believe it? And yet for years and years, this was accepted as proof positive that apes evolved into people. This was one of the specimens that was used for over 40 years to convince school children that evolution is a fact. The story went something like this. You can believe in creation if you want to, but the facts are all on the side of evolution. Well, in this case, the facts turned out to be a bit of ape jaw and human skulls stained to make them look older. That was all there ever was. And yet Piltdown was discovered, or I should say invented, in 1912. It wasn't shown to be a hoax until the 1950s. Think of the devastating impact that had for so many years. Here in Sydney, there's an ecologist, a lady who has her doctorate in ecology, that became a creationist partly because when she was doing her doctoral work in the late 1950s, Piltdown was still being taught in some of her classes as a missing link. And it made her wake up to evolution and begin to think about things. When I was fossil hunting in central Sweden in an area called Kinnekulla, at least in English, here was a little museum, and I don't read a whole lot of Swedish, but the only thing I could see on this geologic chart of evolution that Piltdown man was still listed in 1982 as part of the evolutionary story. And so things, this is the trouble. Evolutionists often forget to tell the media they've changed their mind about some of these things. There's another lesson here too. This is simply an enlargement of a photograph that shows all of the famous evolutionists at the time of the Piltdown discovery gathered around this skull. You know, sometimes your children wonder, and young people wonder, they ask you, how can you be right? What about the experts? How could all those experts on evolution be so wrong about such an important matter as human origins? Answer, wouldn't be the first time. In fact, when they looked at it later, after 40 years, LaGrose Clark said the file marks on the teeth sprang immediately to the eye. It wasn't that clever a hoax. The stone tools had been shaped by steel instruments. That should have been a clue. The fossils buried with Piltdown were mammal fossils imported from North Africa. That might have been a clue, and so on. And yet all that deception, all kinds of doctoral dissertations done on this, and yet nobody recognized it for all those years as a hoax. Well, a couple of others just about in the same category, Java Man and Peking Man. Java Man, as it was called, given a scientific name, by the way, originally Pithecanthropus, which literally means ape man, was discovered by a man named Dubois, a Dutchman, who sailed to Java specifically to find the missing link. And thrashing around in the jungle for a while, he came across an upper leg bone and a skull cap and a gravel deposit over 50 feet apart. Well, the one thing you know for sure is that you haven't found anything. There's no reason to connect the leg bone with the skull cap if it's a gravel deposit by definition. Those are broken fragments of rock that have been picked up and transported. You'd expect to mix all sorts of things together. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that he found ordinary human skulls in the same deposit. But he didn't tell anybody about those for over 30 years. Because if he'd shown them the ordinary human skulls and then said, I'm going to put these two together and make an ape-man missing link, nobody would have listened because human beings were already there. You couldn't have the ancestor buried in the same deposit. So he just kept them under wraps for 30 years, then finally gave up on his own idea. But notice how hard those ideas die. Here's a cover of Time magazine from a few years ago with Richard Leakey on the front and that cover story, How Man Became Man. And it starts off like so many articles do, ridiculing creation and creationists. And then it says the facts begin to roll in. Java Man, Neanderthal Man. All these things. Even the evolutionists ought to be horribly embarrassed about this. But they keep forgetting to tell the news media that they've changed their minds. Even the National Geographic, that article November of 1985, just last November, great big full-color spread on the origin of man, terribly embarrassing to an evolutionist. Even the story of evolution is one that no respectable evolutionist would have anything to do with at the present time. In one of the meetings, we just brought it up and just turned the page and just labeled it with errors. If you wrote the errors in red ink, you wouldn't be able to read the copy. And I'm not talking about real errors. I'm just talking about errors in telling the evolutionary story correctly. They didn't even have the evolutionary story correct. And it's really kind of interesting how that goes. Well, Java Man is off the list again. Perhaps the most interesting, in one, well, I guess they're all interesting, but one of the more interesting is the story of Peking Man. These were some skulls that were found in caves outside of Peking, China, back before World War II. They were found in a cave with the bones of lots of other different kinds of animals and so on. The only thing that was found of, quote, Peking Man, unquote, given the scientific name originally Sinanthropus. By the way, Java and Peking have now been renamed Homo erectus. But the only thing that was found of Peking Man were some skulls. You didn't find the neck bones and the arm bones and leg bones and all that, just the skulls. And the skulls were all bashed in from the rear. Okay, the skulls themselves were entirely ape-like. There wasn't anything particularly human about them at all. Now, they have been lost, the originals, but we still have some casts. We don't know how faithful they are to the original. But even the casts don't look anything like a human being at all. But there were these tools, okay, buried in the same area. And so here you have an ape skull plus tools. And so somebody thought that must be a tool-using ape, hence an ape man. Okay, that was the kind of logic. Now, nobody thought that perhaps the tools were used on the ape rather than by. But as it so happens, and I guess this is far enough after morning tea, you won't object to my telling you this story, but the monkey meat is just terrible, stringy and sinewy and tough. You can boil it for days and nothing happens. Even the water gets tough after a while. And so nobody much eats monkey meat, but if you're hungry, and you see some monkeys swinging through the trees, what you do is lop off the heads, boil up the heads, bash in the rear, and eat the goodie out. It's considered a delicacy in parts of Southeast Asia to this day. Any of you seen the American movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom? Ah, that's what they were having for dessert, was Peking Man on the half shell. At any rate, it looks like Peking Man was man's meal, not at all man's ancestor, and it's no longer considered, serious by knowledgeable evolutionists, even though, again, it wasn't long ago I saw a television special about the discovery and all that as if it still amounted to something. Well, in 1925, emphasis shifted to a new discovery that had been made just a couple of years early. Nebraska man, given the scientific name Hesperopithecus Harold Cooki. Now, in this particular case, the only thing ever discovered was a single tooth. But with a little imagination, okay, the tooth was imagined to belong to a skull, the skull was imagined to belong to a skeleton, and the skeleton was given flesh, hair, and a family. The reason this picture is all full of dots here is it's simply a blow-up of a photograph from a London newspaper at the time of the famous Scopes trial in America. That trial, in Tennessee, where the man was accused of teaching evolution in the classroom. And it was really kind of a turning point. It was one thing in which the news media ridiculed creation and the Bible and Bible believers so thoroughly that it actually embarrassed a lot of them. And in fact, just the Sunday before we came down here, Ken and I were treated to a fantastic sermon. It was really a terrific send-off for this particular ministry. And just talking about the wiles of the devil and how Satan can attack and so on, that was part of it. But one of the most effective weapons Satan uses is ridicule. And he went on, Satan also uses threats and intimidation, a whole bunch of other things. But we don't see much of that in our world because most Christians cave in on ridicule. It's a sad story. And of course, I'm a human being too, and I know what it feels like. And it is very difficult, really, to survive ridicule. And so the whole biblical faith was just held up to ridicule at that time. And yet, you know what they were using as their evidence that science had proved human evolution? Neanderthal man, just ordinary human beings like you and I. Australian Aboriginals and blacks were still considered subhuman at the time of the Scopes trial. Java man, nothing more than a couple of bones and a gravel deposit with human skulls. Peking man, man's meal. And Nebraska man, this was the big evidence. And Piltdown man, if I didn't mention that. Piltdown was the real hero, but so was Nebraska man. And yet 2 years after the Scopes trial, you didn't read about this in the papers, 2 years after the Scopes trial, they found an identical tooth in the real skull attached to the real skeleton. It wasn't an ape man, that's for sure. It wasn't an ape, it wasn't a man. You know what it was? It was a tooth of an extinct pig. A wild pig. Nothing at all related to human origins. And yet nobody ever mentions that. You know, that slid over and so on. Well, of course, that was back in 1925. And you might say, well, scientists have long since learned not to make so much out of a single tooth. Well, it might surprise you that it wasn't until 1979, just a few years ago, that Ramapithecus was dropped as a false start to the human parade. Now, Ramapithecus is this one right here. Okay, the first ape to really walk upright on all fours, and this is just part of a spread in Natural History magazine. And if you saw the whole thing, the other page, you know, you have the ground walking ape, you know, on all fours, and then you have Ramapithecus standing upright, and then you have him standing more and more upright as you go across the page. And to this day, in the Museum of Man there in San Diego, in the Natural History Museum, you can buy a tote bag in the gift shop with this picture on it. The four-legged ape, and then Ramapithecus, and all of these other things. And so the Rama ape, which is what Ramapithecus means, is obviously a crucial specimen here. It's the first one walking upright, so the hands are free to use tools and the brain's free to develop, so the evolutionary story goes. But how did they know it walked upright? It was reconstructed as a biped, walking upright on two legs, on the basis of, there it is again, teeth and jaws alone. And of course, that's the best possible evidence you can have of how the knee joint works, is to look in the mouth, right? In this case, it's even worse than you might imagine. And the story here is found in Discover magazine, the American edition at least, is July of 1983. I found that often the same stories appear, but in different dates in America and Australia. The Ape in Your Past is the cover story. And here it shows a man in a business suit removing this thin mask of humanity to reveal the ape below and so on. And it talks in here about Ramapithecus, and it admits that Ramapithecus is no longer considered an ancestor, but it tells why it was thought, on the basis of teeth and jaws to walk upright, it was the tooth that was not found. Okay, the tooth that was not found. And we're talking here about a canine tooth, one of these ones that has a little sharp point on it, and the hole where the canine tooth was supposed to be was very small. Okay, small hole, it must have been a small tooth. I suppose it could have been a long, skinny tooth, but they decided it was a small tooth. If it had a small canine tooth, that means it couldn't use its teeth for fighting or aggression. And if it couldn't use its teeth for that, then it would have to use weapons. And if it had to use weapons, it would have to be able to stand upright so its hands would be free to use weapons. Voila, it walked upright. Well, now they've discovered more of the teeth and jaws, more of the skeleton and so on. And Ramapithecus is back to being an ape only, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing as far as human origins are concerned. And again, that was 1979. And yet I will bet that in universities right now, this is still being taught in anthropology classes as an ape-man ancestor, as on the lineage man, even though professionals working currently in the field have dropped it from that list. In fact, when you stop to think about it, everything most of you learned when you were in school has been dropped off the list. Everything that was once used as an argument for the evolution of man from apes has been totally discarded by knowledgeable evolutionists themselves. There's only one left. And I think most of you know what I'm talking about here. It's the group that includes that famous specimen called Lucy, and the group name is Australopithecus. Well, as everybody here knows, Australo means southern, and so these were southern apes, although it doesn't really mean Australian here. This group was originally found in South Africa. And there are several famous specimens included here. One was a specimen that Lewis and Mary Leakey found back in 1959, originally called Zinjanthropus. Zinj man, Nutcracker man was the name for it. And the skull was nothing at all, any way, shape, or form remotely human. It was just a great big ape skull with a huge lower jaw, great big sagittal crest across the top and so on. Nothing at all remotely human about it, but there were these little tools. Okay, see? Same mistake they made with Peking man, where the tools used by the owner of that skull or on the owner of that skull. Well, 13 years after Lewis and Mary Leakey became world famous, after they got National Geographic support and all this, Richard Leakey found bones, quote, virtually indistinguishable from those of modern man, unquote, in rock layers below his father's discovery. So that one's off the list. The Australopithecine group begins to shrink a little bit as far as significance is concerned, but the one that's left right now that's attracting all the attention is Lucy. And this is the discovery Donald Johanson made in the Afar region of Africa, and it's given the name Australopithecus afarensis. And at least we have some information to go by here. The skeleton is about 40% complete. In fact, we have enough information that we can now say for sure that Johanson is absolutely wrong about what Lucy is. Originally, Donald Johanson humbly believes that Lucy is the most important fossil discovery made by any human being in all of human history. And he managed to convince the news media that, and got an Institute for Human Biology out at Berkeley and so on. Very good place, I would suggest. And so he discovered Lucy in 1975. It wasn't until 1982 and 83 that any other scientist had a chance to look at the bones. He kept saying, oh, I'm not finished with them yet. Oh, I'm not finished with them yet. Meantime, he becomes a world-famous authority on human origins and so on, and nobody else, no scientists have had a chance to critique it. Now that other scientists have looked at it, they say, where did you ever get an idea like that? Look at the curve on the finger bones. This isn't a walking ape on the prairie. This is a tree-swinging ape. Why do you think these are male and female? These are two different species, and on and on and on. In fact, the definition for this particular group of Australopithecines would fit living chimpanzees. Adrienne Zillman says, you think you've got something? And she has a diagram, a new scientist, with Lucy's skeleton as half of the diagram, and the ordinary rainforest chimpanzee on the other half. And they fit so closely, you know, it would be better to say the rainforest chimpanzee were our ancestor, except it's right there in the zoo where we can see it isn't our ancestor. But you can see you can't become famous if your ancestor said, look, I found it, the ancestor of the chimpanzee. You know, you don't get famous for that. And yet there's no reason to think that it's anything but that at all. And interestingly enough, there's several evolutionary scientists who would agree with us on that. One of the questions that's taken up here that in a sense is of only passing significance is whether Lucy walked upright or not. And Donald Johanson assures us that Lucy walked upright. I've heard him give his talk on Lucy and talk about unconvincing. It was a very good travel story, but not convincing at all. And other scientists have looked at the pelvic joint, looked at the knee joint, and so on, including Charles Oxnard at the University of Southern California. He made some dramatic comments in an address to biology teachers back in America. He says, I know what you're being taught, and I know that Lucy is supposed to be this ancestor and so on. He says, but a study of the anatomy warns us against a ready acceptance of that view. And he tells these biology teachers, remember the mistakes of the past. Remember Piltdown Man. Remember Hesperopithecus. Which one was that? That was that pig's tooth called Nebraska Man. He says we made some bad mistakes in the past. Let's don't make bad mistakes like that again. And so instead of just doing what Johanson did, which was take the knee joint and kind of look at it that way, and the pelvis and kind of look at it that way and so on, he took measurements, fed all his measurements into a computer, along with measurements on orangs and gorillas and chimps and man and all of these other things, plotted out on the graph. Does Lucy walk upright? Does he have the joint structure like man over here, like the apes over here, or somewhere in between? Over here with the apes, nothing at all, no evidence at all that Lucy would have walked upright in the human manner, more like a chip or an orang at the very best. And so his educational conclusion, he tells these teachers, be critical. We've got to teach our students to think for themselves, to separate fact from assumption and not just swallow what they see in newspapers and television and so on. But in a real sense, it wouldn't make much difference in a way because there's things like the rainforest chimpanzee that spend a fair amount of time walking upright and still don't count as human ancestors because we have other discoveries along the way. And here the Leakey family has done more good for creationists than anybody else recently. And it's been my pleasure in San Diego to hear Richard and Mary Leakey both and Donald Johanson. And in many ways, I have a real respect for Richard and Mary Leakey. They seem to be real honest bone hunters. Now, they're convinced of evolution. They just don't question it. You know, they just take that as their starting point, and they're looking for evidence to support the concept of evolution. But at least that's ahead of Johanson. And so on. At least they want to, you know, confirm or refute their theories on the basis of bones that are actually found. And so the Leakeys and Johanson are having some real head-to-head conflict. Battle of the bones is the way one newspaper article put this. And it's really quite a lot of fun. The two of them were on the Walter Cronkite show at one time, and Cronkite gave the piece of chalk to Donald Johanson. Johanson himself is telling this story. He says, okay, diagram your theory on the board for the audience. So he goes over the chalkboard, puts a nice big Y there with Lucy right at the branch, right at the fork of the Y. Apes going this way, man going that way. Okay, and he explains that. Then Cronkite gives the chalk to Richard Leakey. He says, now let's see your idea. So Richard Leakey takes the chalk. First thing he does is go over, great big X across Johansson's blackboard. Then goes over to his blackboard, point, great big question mark, and sat down. Johansson told us, I got so flustered after that I don't remember anything that happened the rest of the program. But I think here the Leakeys are being more honest with the evidence. In the magazine article, it shows Johansson's Y with Lucy at the middle. So he has all the Leakey finds over here, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's one thing that makes the Leakeys mad. But the Leakey's diagram has man here, apes here. The lines come close together, but they don't meet at the bottom of the page. Now again, the Leakeys are evolutionists, there's no doubt about that. But they're honest enough with the evidence to know that no link between man and the apes has yet been found. What they have been finding, and they're our best creation research team, almost, we got going except for Andrew. Actually, they've been extending the lineage of man further and further back. They've been extending the lineages of apes further and further back, and they keep being separate as far back as they go. So we're really grateful for the work that they're doing over there. And just last fall, a real nice piece of work came in. The Leakey team discovered a 12-year-old boy. And the skeleton was so complete, they knew it was a boy. They knew he would have been approximately 12 years old. And that he was already 5'6". The estimate would have been, as an adult, he would have been about 6'2". And everything about that boy was completely human. And so the evolutionary articles in the paper wrote, this is astonishing. We've looked like human beings for this long. It was only supposed to be a few thousand years. We've been Homo sapiens sapiens. And again, I heard Richard Leakey then in April give a report on this discovery. And he wanted to call this boy Homo erectus. And he's dead wrong. He can't do that. He made a scientific mistake. Now, who am I, just an ordinary person, to say Richard Leakey made a scientific mistake? Answer, just an ordinary person who's a scientist who knows the rules of nomenclature. And so he wanted to call him Homo erectus because he was so old. It was before man was supposed to have evolved, but he can't do it legitimately. If you had Richard Leakey and me up before a systematics board, who's got the right name and who doesn't, I would have to win. There's no contest, no debate. Everything is completely human. The only reason, in fact, the only even questionable thing was a brain volume, but he said it's at least 900 cc's, which is fully in the range of normal intelligent human beings at the present time. There would be nothing that he could point to the panel of experts to say, I want to use the name Homo erectus. He'd have to give it the name Homo sapiens. But here man is, just like the bones he found below his father's discovery. He finds ordinary human beings further and further back in the record. The one that's hit the news just recently, and I've got it here, they're what they're calling the black skull because it was stained black, it was a black color. Now the news article, I wish I'd brought the whole thing, I don't know why I ripped the cover off, because again it has that diagram in there. This is this month's Discover magazine, see? Getting the latest and greatest right here. Discover magazine, and so it has Johansson's diagram with Lucy at the V. Then it has the Leakey diagram on the other page, but here again they've lied to us. They've got the Leakey diagram that shows two lines of apes and one line of human beings, and they show them coming together. But if you read the caption under it, the whole point of the diagram is that the Leakeys say we have not found the link between apes and man at the present time. They haven't seen the lines come together. Not only do they have ordinary human beings too far back for the typical evolutionary scene, but this black skull now is an ape. Now, if you look at the articles in the paper, you think they've discovered a human ancestor, but the whole point of the discovery, and I heard this straight from Richard Leakey himself, and if you read correctly, you can see it in there, the whole point is that it is an ape. And it's a specialized ape. That's the significance of the discovery. And now he has proved, he was just saying that tentatively in April, now he's saying it firmly. Now we know for sure Johansson is wrong because we have human beings below Lucy and we have specialized apes below Lucy. Lucy ain't nothing. And it gives the Leakeys a great pleasure to say that. Well, obviously none of the Australopithecines could be man's ancestor if man was walking around before Lucy was fossilized. Okay? And it so happens that's what we have. And here's some tracks that were originally discovered by Mary Leakey, and I got to hear her give the original report on these in San Diego. And there's some footprints there, left, right, stride, and so on. The stride is kind of small, the foot's kind of small, but not, completely within the human range. And keep in mind, these footprints are made in damp volcanic ash, so the person might be kind of picking their way slowly and carefully across here. In her original report, she said, boy, oh boy, she says, these things look very human. And we're not really sure what they are. She didn't want to call them human at that time because this is long before man is supposed to have evolved. Well, another man, Russell Tuttle from the University of Chicago, went out there and studied the tracks, and he tried to find some other animal or some other thing that could have made the tracks. You know what he did? He even hired a dancing bear to jump up and down in the mud to see if a dancing bear would make tracks like this. I'm not sure what that would have meant. But it wasn't bear tracks either. A bear actually has a foot closer to us than the apes do. But it wasn't that either. And he wrote up an article, I've got shocking, disturbing, upsetting news. You can't tell the difference between these tracks and ordinary human tracks. Now to me, that's not shocking, upsetting, or disturbing. That's great. That's man walking around before man's supposed evolutionary ancestors. And in her son's television special, Mary Leakey just called them human tracks. And so now and of course she had no objection to that originally, and that's why the Leakeys say we got to dig deeper to find the ancestor for human beings. We already know that everything, Lucy included, is no help because we got separate apes and separate man as far back as you can go. By the way, it's not just footprints. Whole skeletons of human beings have been found long before man's ancestors were supposed to have been fossilized. Ken told you about the Guadalupe woman and the work that John Mackay is doing on that at the present time. That's great. But really it was back in the 1800s that a geologist in Italy was involved in the discovery of a whole family of skeletons. Okay, not just a few bone fragments, but rather complete skeletons and skulls of several individuals called Castanedolo man. I guess they don't have anything with that word on it. Castanedolo, complete skeletons in the same formation, mid-tertiary Miocene, long before people are supposed to have evolved. One of the famous evolutionists of that day, Sir Arthur Keith, said when one looks at the Castanedolo finds, a feeling of incredulity, unbelief, rises within him. You're like, I can't believe it. He says because to accept the discovery would shatter his beliefs in evolution. Okay? And he says, but he can't reject the discovery without injuring his sense of truth. There really is good, well-documented evidence. And then he says, clearly we cannot pass by Castanedolo in silence. How many times have you heard of Castanedolo? Not at all, have you? It's only in the advanced textbooks that they have Castanedolo and a whole bunch of these other things. And I asked an anthropologist one time, I said, why don't you tell your freshman students about Castanedolo and these other things? Oh, he said it would confuse them. I think it might inform them. So as far as the evidence is concerned, we're right back to the same story that we read in Genesis. If you read Genesis, you sure do get a head start in scientific inquiry, don't you? I've often thought, somebody spent 20 years digging around in Grand Canyon trying to explain what he found, and then came up after these 20 years kind of exhausted and saw a bench over there, and here's a Gideon Bible. He opens it up. That's it. That's what I've been discovering. So man and apes are separate and will be separate as far as we find them because they were completed as separate kinds. What we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. I think that's the real thrust that Ken and I want to give all of you, especially since so many of you are here to train in the ministry. Take God at His Word. You can build your life. You can build an approach to every area of your life on what God says, and count on the world, the actual created world, the world in that sense, as a help, as an evangelical tool as you're here this afternoon. What we see in God's world agrees, encourages us in our confidence in God's Word.